Welcome to Jersey Justice, a civil law podcast, solving the world's problems one podcast at a time.
But anyway, I want to thank you for doing this, for coming here. I also want to, I've thanked you before for everything you've done for our country, and I want to thank you again, in this more formal way. And thank you for everything that you continue to do for our country, by speaking up and all the stuff you do. But just, to give people the sense of the kind of guy you are, when I called you and asked you if you'd come on to our podcast in the first podcast, you didn't hesitate to say yes, and you didn't take time to go research how many, clicks we get and views we get, and that's cool, and I really appreciate that, and that says a lot for who you are. Just so that people know out there, I first met Bill. Not really sure where I met you, but you popped up in my LinkedIn feed somehow, and then I don't know. I think I clicked or liked something, and then I went to an event you were holding. It's probably like 3 years ago. You were holding with Corey Jones. You were holding an event to show people how to protect themselves with firearms and in mass shooting scenarios and things like that. And I thought it was the coolest thing ever because it was a group of Navy SEALs and Special Forces guys that were doing it, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And I'm not like a gun person at all. Like, I understand the Second Amendment and I respect all that, but just for me, I'm afraid of guns. It's like a thing. But when I did that course with you, and it wasn't live ammunition, it was the airsoft, but they look live, and it was really kind of like it was really realistic. And after I did that, I was way less afraid of guns, and I felt like a lot more secure. I felt like if something ever happened where there was a mass shooting or there was some stuff hit the fan, that I would at least have a fighting chance. And I thought that was awesome public service as well, and it's cool. And then, to be honest with you too, when I see you, I get a little starstruck. I get a little nervous and stuff. No, I'm just being honest, because, when someone says Navy SEAL, I mean, I think most people are like super respectful of that, and see it. And I don't know. So for me, and then I did your SEAL swim, which I understand is to honor our nation, to honor our veterans, and also to raise money for veterans in need and stuff. And I did that SEAL swim thing with you.
And that's no easy feat. That speaks volumes about who you are and the commitment level that you bring to the table.
Yeah. Well, the one thing you say, you're like, oh, the treacherous Hudson River. The Hudson River ain't that treacherous. The chemicals and the organisms in the Hudson River, I think, were way more dangerous than the currents.
Yeah.
For me, anyway.
We try to time it so it floods.
Yes.
So the water's a little fresher. But yeah, that's why I glow in the dark.
It's an awesome event, and it's amazing. Like, you did that grassroots. You got a lot of your people together, and it. I'm in this rowing group where we row, and it's a lot of these crazy guys row for, many miles and stuff. And just organizing that's a lot of work, being involved in that. And it's a ton of work what you do with that Navy SEALs. And again, I thank you.
Well, thank you. Together we send a positive, patriotic message of unity for our entire country to see. We raised a lot of money to help veterans at the same time. So I'm proud to sponsor up with the Navy SEAL Foundation. If any of you guys are interested, it's an epic event. I think it's the most patriotic event in our nation. Bring your family. It's August 10th. Check out, Google up Navy SEAL Foundation, New York City SEAL Swim. It's an epic time.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I feel like completely like unprepared here because Mark Morris is an awesome attorney in our office. When I think of Mark and some of his successes as an attorney, one was, did you ever did you ever go to like a mosh pit? Or,
Yes.
Yeah, I did that back in the day too.
Me too.
But it's funny. It's funny, like when you get older and how things change, like, mosh pits. And then we had a case here where a guy was, if you're younger moshing, that's one thing, but this guy was a bit older and he was kind of out of the mosh pit and some guy landed on his head
Ouch.
Yeah,
so this is the case I always think when I think of Mark and being a successful plaintiff's attorney. What was?
I'm happy to be defined by that case somewhat. Yeah, a guy it was like a heavy metal punk rock concert, and I think he was in his early 40s. So he's kind of beyond the days where he's getting in the pit and throwing down and all that. But so he was up near the stage. I think he had friends that were in the band, and these guys were like going up on stage and cartwheeling off and stage diving and all that. And they had security personnel that were there. That the whole reason they were there was supposed to be to stop people from doing that. This type of thing went on for like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and it's all kind of in good fun. But at some point, there's a reason that you see like, hey, no stage diving, no moshing. It's because people ultimately are going to get hurt. And if you throw yourself in the pit, that's kind of the risk you're taking. But if you're trying to stay away from that and you're just there like our guy was, you're trying to remove yourself from that risk. So these security guys were just letting people go up, and it's the end of this one band song. I probably listened to it like 50 times because it's on YouTube, and I'm watching the video to see exactly when the guy flips onto him. And it's the very end of the song, and sure enough, this guy's got a hoodie on, goes up, points, and then does a flip, and he lands right on our guy's head. My client actually was, he's a veteran, and he organized a ton of events. He would do these really long like bike rides. I forget what branch of the service he was in, but he was a police officer up in New Hampshire. He saw like quite a bit of action where I think he was involved in a few shootouts, and so then he was removed from law enforcement, or he stepped back. But this guy who was super active, he biked, he skied, did all this. He was basically temporarily paralyzed. This guy landed on him. He knew enough to be like, don't move my neck, just get EMTs, and took him to Jersey Shore, and they did this pretty major surgery on him. But at the end of the day, he ended up making a great recovery. But it was a case that we prosecuted and we fought, and it ultimately ended up settling for like $2 million.
Yeah, congrats.
No, thanks. And it's again, we always talk like we don't have any clients that would trade the money for the injury, and it's not like we just say that to say it. Like, this guy was such an active person. He surfed, did all these things, and he fought really hard to get back to doing that in any capacity. So, but I'm sure he would prefer not to have gotten
for sure.
paralyzed, had a major neck surgery and all that for a couple $1 million. But
So, Bill, it's funny because like when I see at the different events, and we've had lunch a couple times or whatever, and I, helping out, I always want to talk to you more. And I'm like, you're busy, I'm busy being lawyers.
Yep.
So I think this time's awesome to be able to, because I know you have views and I'd like to, chime in and stuff. So let's do it. What do you want to talk about?
Before, because I know that I came in just to introduce myself before we started, and I was like, oh, hey, Bill, I read up about, and it turned into like a 20-minute conversation. So I know that any windows we open up, it's going to go down a rabbit hole.
Let's do it.
But I just first things first, too, thanks for being our first guest on the newly revamped Jersey Justice podcast.
I'm honored.
I agree with Jerry. I was like, all right.
So let me jump into one topic, okay?
All right, let's do it.
So I went to Catholic school my whole life. I went to Christian Brothers Academy in Lincroft, and I always loved theology and like history and religion. I remember the nuns. I was taught by nuns in grammar school and all this. So I kind of have a good understanding of like Judeo-Christian history and stuff. So. Okay, so when the guys with hang gliders and motorcycles go across the border into Israel and just start killing whoever they can see, everyone agrees that's a bad thing, right? So then Israel, which is a stronger country, goes back and just bombs the hell out of the place and kills way more people and innocent people. Who's right and wrong in that? Now, let me just before. Like, who's right and wrong in that thing? Is anyone right and wrong? But here's the other thing about it. Okay, you say, well, Palestinians started by going across the border. And you say, well, no, Israel's wrong because they killed way more people and they're still doing it. But the thing goes back thousands of years. Like, who owns that land? Does might make right? And if you're going to say, if you or anyone's going to say, well, Israel is wrong and Palestine, it's Palestine. Shouldn't we be giving Georgia back to the Indians? I mean, the Trail of Tears. Shouldn't the Puerto Rico, the Republic, the territory of Puerto Rico, shouldn't they give that island back to the Taino Indians? I mean, what Columbus did, just slaughtering people. I don't know the answers to any of these questions, but I know you have thoughts on this stuff, and what's the answer to all this?
Well, I guess the way I kind of view it, right, is I view it that we all have a right. You know, I go back to the Declaration of Independence. We all have a right, inalienable rights. You know, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and that's kind of where my perspective that's the core where everything originates from. And so when we evaluate, compare, and contrast history and human society and human group behavior, unfortunately, since recorded time, there's a series of oppressive actions. Some of them, in the end, have a silver lining, like with Julius Caesar, with Rome basically conquered most of Europe. He helped civilize most of Europe out of the tribal type of phenomena, right? We have some of that. We have great oppressions and great entities throughout time. What I look at here, as far as there's certain things that I look at when I look at Israel. The first thing is I look at all their actions since 1948, since they declared a state. They were attacked in 1948, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. It was a defensive action.
The 6-Day War.
6-Day War was next. That's 1967. There are Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Algeria. And then you expanded to the Yom Kippur War, and then you had Egypt and Syria. So one of the things, Egypt, as far as they were attacked, right? And one of the things that happened was the way they were attacked. Now, it's different. I don't have any issues with people advocating for a Palestinian state, a separate state, no issues. I actually would not be as staunch advocate as I am for Israel if on October 7th they attacked military targets, or if they actually took military prisoners. Now, there's a distinction between those actions and the actions of what happened October 7th. When you rape, murder, burn, mutilate babies, those atrocities in a civilized society, they have to be held accountable. Hamas can no longer remain in power. Now, one of the things I think about, because I'm a SEAL, I've been to war.
You saw the horrors of radical Islam firsthand.
Firsthand.
Yeah.
Firsthand. And so one of the things I look at is I go, okay, where Israel is at right now, the way they have to militarily respond, a lot of people who don't think tactically. So I gave you 3 incidents where Israel fought multiple neighbors, opponents, right? So one of the things Israel has to be very cognizant of now is the way they engage. You have Hezbollah right up front, right north of them in Lebanon. Syria is not that friendly. Egypt to the south is not that friendly. And so what happens with them? Now, I've been in urban warfare in Baghdad, in Iraq, very urban environment. I've been in Najaf, very urban environment in southern Iraq. And so the thing about urban warfare is imagine this. When you have armed combatants in close vicinity, your ability to negate that threat your risk is greatly increased. And so with urban warfare, the casualty count, if you could clear room by room, building by building, is extremely, extremely increased. Now,
For your own people.
That's right.
Yeah.
So one of the ways Israel is trying to deal with this,
right,
is they realize if we have a high casualty count, it makes us very susceptible to being attacked by Hezbollah, possibly by Lebanon, possibly by Syria, possibly by Egypt, possibly by Turkey.
Yeah.
And so what happens is they can't show blood in the water because there's a possibility of a shark frenzy. So what do? So one of the things they're doing is they're trying to send text messages to basically,
Clear out of the area.
that's right, and
Yeah.
then they send flyers out. But and the strategy they're doing is actually a Napoleon strategy. It's called piecemealing. It's one of the things that the Russians made a mistake in Ukraine. They overexpanded their resources.
Yeah.
Napoleon got the strategy was piecemeal. Basically, at the moment of engagement, I'm going to have more troops at a certain point of impact than you are. I'll negate that threat, and I'm going to repeat that process. And that's how it's like a boa constrictor type of strategy. That's what they're trying to do in Rafah now. Now, one of the things that they have to be cognizant of is they have to try to reduce their count. So they're trying to limit casualties, but at the same time, and hardened structures. Sometimes they're using artillery. Sometimes they're using LGBs, laser-guided bombs, or DPMs, which are GPS-guided bombs, which has a greater casualty count. Now, if you look at the Ukraine-Russian conflict, that's basically what it is. It's a huge artillery battle with entrenched positions. Now, Hamas is playing the long game, and they're actually winning the PR game. Now, Hamas intentionally entrenched their forces with civilians, 100%.
It's so surprising that an organization that would send like a teenager into a crowded thing to blow himself up with the promise that he'll have like 10 virgins in the next life is winning the PR game. That's surprising to me.
Well,
I don't know. I don't get it. Like, I don't understand. Like, so like we're in America, you know, the way I look at this, in many ways, I feel that, you know, warfare and conquest and the history of power is might makes right. I mean, you know, you're like the Declaration of Independence and all that. Yeah, well, that's because we displaced the Indians here. So I look at it like in that way a lot. And so a lot of ways, it's just like, okay, who's on our team?
Well,
and Israel's been an ally forever, maintaining a balance of power in the Middle East and supporting the United States interests. So I just don't understand how Hamas is winning a PR game in America.
Well,
it's really surprising to me.
Well, one of the things about the Indians, they were in a consistent state of tribal warfare.
That's true.
Yeah.
They were not a civilized people.
They weren't unified.
Well, you know, to say that their way of life in some ways wasn't better and freer than in a lot of ways that our civilized society was at the time, I don't know. But they were the majority of the tribes were in a constant state of warfare. And to be sincere, it's not just the Indians. Even today, there's a constant state of conflict and resources. And we're lawyers. We thrive. Basically, that's what we are. We're legal brains that operate in basically a state of conflict where we advocate for different sides. With any successful insurgency ever, any successful revolution has always had outside support, and it's the same thing with Hamas. And the thing that's different about Hamas or Hezbollah is that they're not just proxies of Iran, what they certainly are, or proxies of Turkey, which they certainly are, or proxies for Qatar. We talked about theology. There's a strong Islamic perspective in certain parts of the Islamic world that is grounded in the examples set in the Quran, or the examples set. If you're a Muslim and if you say the Prophet Muhammad, you hold him in such reverence that after that you say, peace be upon him. Now, the example set by the Prophet Muhammad was he was a field commander. He spread Islam by the sword. That is absolutely, he's been in many battles, and there's a significant part of the Quran that talks about the various battles and his leadership in those battles. So he was a war commander. They hold him in the greatest reverence. So there's a large part of the Islamic world that's very opposed to having a Jewish state. And they are, anyone who thinks they're not sophisticated, not well financed, is grossly mistaken. And one of the issues that we have in democracy, there's great pros and cons to democracy. One of the
Churchill said that democracy is a terrible way to organize government,
But it's the best we've got.
but there's nothing better, right?
Yeah.
That's right, because one of the vulnerabilities to democracy is basically these huge finances it takes for these campaigns,
Oh, that's terrible.
and it leads to corruption.
I'm telling you right now,
Yes.
I 100% believe this. The reason for this Trump movement and the reason for that march on the Capitol and vandalizing the Capitol building and all that, in my opinion, it all goes back to the Citizens United opinion, which is a U.S. Supreme Court opinion which permitted unlimited money in politics. And I think that is a terrible decision. And what's happening is, in my opinion, it's all obviously opinion, and I'm the first one to say I could be wrong in anything, is there's so much unfairness out there, and there is so much wealth concentration in the top that so much of the swaths of the nation are just getting screwed. Like in the Rust Belt, all those factories that shut down, all those jobs that went, to China and wherever else, and all this wealth concentration in the top was a big they're fed up with it, and I think that's a big part of that surgence, and that Citizens United opinion really, I think, is the really spark. I think it's the most terrible decision since, I don't know, the decision
Dred Scott.
Exactly, Mark, the Dred Scott
Yeah.
decision that allowed slavery in the country. But it's crazy because when you look at things like Democrats used to be, weren't the Southern Democrats the ones for slavery and racism and all that?
Yeah, I think Lincoln was a Republican.
Yes, and then it was the Solid South.
Yep.
The Solid South. The South would always solid vote Democrat back in the day, probably before the, in the 1800s and all that. And
After the Whigs and the Tories and
Yes.
the Federalists and Anti-Federalists.
And what's crazy is, and I think a lot's that Citizens United opinion is, a lot of the Trump base and stuff is actually embracing a lot of traditional Democrat values.
Yep.
And then you have and I'm not saying I'm for or against the Clintons or whatever, but and then you have Hillary Clinton, which is for the banks, and it's it's shifting. And when we talked before, when you came here, you're oh, I'm coming in hot, you think I'm real liberal and we're gonna go at it. First of all, okay, since we're doing this,
Yeah.
okay, this transgender thing,
Right.
oh my God. Wait a second. So 12-year-olds, 12-year-olds, and you're gonna. Now I get it. If you're born ambiguous, right? Because there's a thing, and then the doctor makes the decision, and they say, okay, make get rid of the one testicle we'll get rid of, and they do a surgical thing. Okay, I get that. But someone who's a guy and at 13 years old is saying, now I'm going to become I just think that's crazy. And the whole thing about the Penn State swimmer, do you know that story?
Indeed.
Oh my! So this Penn State swimmer, and then the girl, I forget, she was on Alabama, she was on Joe Rogan. He's in the girls' locker room completely naked. All the girls are in there. He's a completely intact guy. It's basically this guy running around pretending to be a girl. And then you talk about this woke stuff and, freedom of speech. God forbid anyone in that locker room raises an issue and says, can we please get this guy whose man packages flopping all around the place out of our locker room? They were ostracized. I forget her name, but she's on Joe Rogan. It's the most fascinating thing, because the other thing too is, and I'm sorry I'm dominating the mic right now, but the pendulum swings.
Yeah, well, we hope so.
The pendulum swings, and
Only if good men and women speak up.
and that's why and it wasn't trite or patronizing when I thanked you in the beginning for what you continue to do, because I think it's really important to speak out. But Do you know George Orwell and Animal Farm?
Yes.
Okay. So you had the Bolshevik Revolution and Animal Farm, amazing book for anyone that wants to learn about history, and because they say like if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it.
Yes.
Okay. So like if you look at Animal Farm, amazing book about George Orwell. So Animal Farm is basically where like there was the farmer who was a super oppressive farmer that ran this farm. And then the pigs and the horses and everyone drove the farmer out. And then they had these rules like if you slept in a bed, you were a bad person because only the humans slept in the
right.
beds. And then the pigs became in control, and they had these rules where no animal was permitted to sleep in a bed, but
Unless
then
you're a pig.
and then they made the exception. And what it is it's equating the Bolshevik Revolution, because when the Bolsheviks overturned the czars and became the communists in Russia, they were more oppressive than the Bolsheviks or than the czars that they replaced. And that's what Animal Farm is about. So when the pigs and the horses and the animals kicked out the human running the farm, and then the pigs were in control, they became worse and more oppressive than the farmer was then. And what happens with this whole thing is, so like in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s, where you had the racism and the fire hoses and the March on Montgomery and all that stuff,
Yes.
I actually agree with affirmative action at that point.
Yes.
Because you needed it, because, okay, but now we've elected a black president, and now you're going to look at someone's application and say, okay, minority gets in, white male does not get in. That's racist. That's clearly racist. And that's the thing about the pendulum swinging, which you, I think, call woke sometimes. So
Yes.
anyway.
Well, you can. It's so funny that you
And you thought we were going to battle on this.
I'm waiting to see if you flip to notes on that, because you asked about Israel, you opened up to a page, you started out with transgender. I'm wondering if you got notes for that.
Well, I read that book, and it's so funny because when you believe you're morally correct,
Yes.
the danger of that is that you shut down critical thinking, and that you believe all your actions are right. And you can see small examples of this type of playing out now, where I saw Rutgers promoting their commencement speakers, and all of them that I saw promoted were African American. Now, I commend, they seemed like they all had great things they could bring to the table and offer advice to students, and I commend them for that. But it does appear there's promoting a racial preference. When I looked at Rutgers Law School and Rutgers Newark and their pictures of their graduation ceremonies, it did seem like the vast majority of the pictures were African Americans. Now, I think it's a great thing that so many African Americans are getting an education and doing well.
How about just people are getting an education?
Yeah, I think it's a great thing. So right. You're so right.
Why do we have to say?
I know.
Now, in the 50s, 60s, I say yes, when it
Yes.
was blatant racism, but
Right.
we elected a black president. We have an African American, I think, Indian vice president.
I think the counter argument to it is that you only have to go back so far to where people's grandparents are still involved in like getting sprayed down with fire hoses.
Yeah.
And like we're maybe another generation or two away from being like, all right, let's pull back on some of this stuff. I think from what I've seen, that's some of the counter argument, because we sit here and again, we're all, the three of us who are talking are white males, who I'm
Public
sure.
enemy number one.
Yeah,
Well,
but you had a tough upppbringing. You weren't born with a silver spoon in your mouth, right?
No, I was blue collar family. You can look at my teeth.
So why? Why?
Went to war to go to college.
So why should someone have had a leg up when you were coming up and when you were going, just because you happen to have been a white male? That's not fair.
Well, it's not fair, no. To think, and Mark, you brought up a great point. Absolutely, I disdain racism, and absolutely one of the flaws and stains in our country was that there was to be sincere systemic racism, and it was horrible. And I think our country is taking great measures to meet up to those great values in the Constitution of equality, of due process of freedom of speech, right? And that was, you had the Civil War, we had hundreds of thousands of Americans die. You had the Civil Rights Movement, women's suffrage movement, even the gay and lesbian movement. They were all great movements. And I understand, how evil that was. Now, what's happened now, though, it kind of reminds me of what's happened with the Pilgrims. Well, they were prosecuted for their religious rights in Europe, so they came here, and what did they do? They did the same thing. And it's almost kind of like the Animal Farm, where I'm very concerned because you talked about Dred Scott. And Brown v. Board overturned Dred Scott because Dred Scott basically said separate but equal. But Brown v. Board said, no, you can't have separate but equal. And it stated one of the reasons why they stated it is because when you have African Americans had inferiority schools, that they were basically receiving psychological harm, right? And that could not, because of that psychological harm, it could not possibly be separate but equal. They're inverse and they don't mix, right? And so one of the things that I think now, gentlemen, and we take it back to the biggest poison in Palestine and some parts of the Middle East, is absolutely they teach hate. They teach hate from a young age up, and it's ingrained, and that's a poison seed.
In World War II, when we beat Japan and we were clearing those islands, do you know a lot of the civilians on those islands, you know what they did instead of surrender to the Americans? I'm talking the civilians, what they did.
Jumped off cliffs.
Exactly. Yeah. Tell us why. Why'd they do that?
An ideology, right? I don't want to cut you off, but wasn't Japan all like no surrender?
It's Bushido, what you were saying.
Code Bushido. They basically it was an ideology. It was absolutely a warrior cult ideology, and pride and honor. Now,
but no, I understood it was also because they were so indoctrinated to hate or to fear the U.S. soldier.
Yes,
and that goes along what you're saying in Afghanistan and some of these Middle Eastern countries where they teach hate and teach that American is the great Satan. That's kind of what you're saying.
Well, it's not just America. It's basically anything that's against Sierra law. And so one of the things I'm afraid of, gentlemen, is I'm afraid of with the CRT, critical race theory, is because in my opinion, what it does is it does two things. I think similar to the reasoning in Brown v. Board, is I think it does psychological harm to white young students because they're in an institutionalized environment. There's school systems where the professors and teachers have a lot of influence over their lives and even their peers. And that's why these professors and these institutions are really able to put on the gas pedal any type of protest. If I believe that the same people marching for BLM, the same people that were marching in what are those guys called? They dress up in black, Antifa, and the same people now with these Palestinian pro-Hamas. I think it's the same, a lot of the same group, and they're being pressed by a lot of the same influences. And my fear with CRT is, one, it's teaching psychological.
What is it, though? What is critical race theory? What's your understanding what that is? I don't even understand what it is, really.
That's actually what I was going to ask, too, because my understanding is basically essentially the idea that white people at one point oppressed other groups and things, which, again, I guess we're speaking openly, is essentially the truth, like that we had slavery in the 1800s. We've
but
talked
who's
about
we? I never oppressed anyone.
Totally, 100%. But so we say we, it's like history is history. I understand like history is told by the victors and things, and I think frankly we probably already get a pretty whitewashed, watered down version of a lot of things in history. So when I hear like, oh, they're teaching critical race theory in like elementary schools, I have no recollection of a teacher being like, you, Mr. Morris, should never have oppressed those black people. It's, there was slavery. White people owned black people. That is a fact. Like, it's like a fact that can't be changed. So that's I guess what I want to kind of get to is what is the distinction then of just history as it's presented and critical race theory?
Absolutely, that is true, right? But it doesn't. That's a sample, and it's a horrible sample that's distinction of this country. But Africans themselves had slaves. In the
100%.
Arabs in the Middle East had plenty of slaves.
Yeah.
Right? The Aztecs had slaves. They were brutal. Every race, the Japanese, we were talking about the Japanese earlier, they were brutal. The Mongolians were brutal. So throughout history, throughout time, there have been extreme races and governments and entities that have been extremely oppressed. The Romans, throughout time, and every race that have had this very horrible, you can't mistreat anybody worse, right? That's what it's happened, but it's not distinct to Caucasian Europeans.
100%, yeah.
But this country was founded by Caucasian Europeans, and they practiced it. Now, what happened was, one of the things that's distinct about it was, the truth was that one of the things that's different, that separates us, is the Civil War that people don't talk about, where hundreds of thousands of Americans died to end that. And then you talk about the Civil Rights Movement, and you had some great leaders in that movement. Some of them were also white involved, and some of the financiers were also white. And so a lot of things are a lot more complex than they seem. They're not pushing that in CRT. In my opinion, what they're pushing is kind of, and this is my opinion, is that European Americans are colonizers and racist. And so what happens is that they push these unconscious bias type of perspectives. And it does a couple things to one. One is, I think, it does this like psychological damage to white children, where they feel they feel like internally that they're not good, righteous people, right? Just because of who they are. And to me, that's scary. Like, they're teaching white children to hate themselves. And that, to me, is a sin.
At what level, though? Like, at what stage? Because I think about, like, you go to elementary school, it's like Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims and the Native Americans sat down and that's what you learn when you're like a kid. Then as you get older, I think about high school, and I remember the stuff like Manifest Destiny, like essentially like imperialism, all that. But at what stage, I guess, is it where they start talking about critical race theory, or that you see it kind of making the kids?
Like, where is this happening?
Well, I think this actually, the word depends on what jurisdiction, if it's public, if it's private, if it's in the city, if it's not. And in some areas, I would imagine it's batshit crazy from day one, K1, and it's the education can be the most beautiful gift, but it can also a poison education can be the worst sin. And when you're teaching an individual, a kid, to hate themselves because of their race, that's the worst thing. And you think about it, almost reminds me of a speech I heard Malcolm X talk once, because I've studied a lot of great speakers, and I tried to think, why was he able to reach his audience in such a way when others weren't? And so, of course, I've studied Malcolm X. And this speech was a beautiful speech. And he goes, who taught you to hate the way your nose looks? Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair or your skin color? Who taught you to hate your language, right? And it's funny because the same points he made then, and which were all valid points, that's my biggest one of my biggest arguments to critical race theory, is because they're teaching white kids to hate themselves.
And Malcolm X's answer to that is the white man did. To those questions.
And you know what?
Yeah.
He was right. He was right. They did. But guess what?
No, I don't think he was right, because just the phrase "the white man" or blacks or Germans or Jewish people, I have a problem with those phrases, because you're throwing them all into a bucket. We should look at people as individuals.
Well, you have a good. You know what? It's so funny that you said
like, once we start this language or this this nomenclature of the they and that group and this group and Democrats and I have a problem with that.
Deplorable.
The haves, the have-nots.
It's individuals and people and
The logic to that is it's actually the reasoning that it's very dangerous. And here's the reason why it's extremely dangerous. Is because if you look, there's a book called On War. I forget the name of the author. But it talks about the history of warfare, and it talks about some of the strides in military training that they did to actually increase the proficiency rate of combatants. And in these studies they did, is they talked about how they did certain languages where they dehumanize.
I knew you were going to say that word. Yeah. I don't know if I've read that or familiar with it, but like you make the enemy less human.
Yeah, you have to dehumanize them. That's why you call it the Krauts, the nips, whatever they, what they would call them in.
Charlie.
Charlie.
Viet Cong.
Because you want to dehumanize. If you dehumanize, it's easier to kill them.
That's what
That's right.
Sorry to cut you up, but that trench warfare and things, World War I can only imagine how brutal that is, or the things when you got to, bayonet a guy right there. I mean, there's no form of war, I feel like, that you can say, like, isn't so traumatic and brutal. But
here's the truth in war. The truth in war is the only thing that matters is that you live. And any way you can reduce that threat, that's the outcome. Because if your life is at risk, that's how you're thinking, right? So that's one of the things I'm scared of. I'm very scared, and if you look at some of the stuff now, it's okay to basically be racist against white people.
Yeah, it's terrible.
And people aren't calling it out. And that's one of the other big dangers about critical race theory, is now you have all these other Americans and other individuals, and they're being taught the same thing as these white kids. And so they're being taught prejudice and hate and disdain towards white people. And so I actually have a theory. And my theory is this. I look at what happened in Nazi Germany, and it was similar type of the way the government reacted after the Versailles Treaty and after the rise of the Nazis, and the way they demonized the Jewish people, right? They singled them out.
Oh, yeah.
And it was okay to be brutal to them. And so then what happened? And it led to violence. And if you look at
the evening of the broken glass,
Crystal Knock,
where the brown shirts went around and destroyed all the windows of the shops that happened to have been owned by Jewish
Crystal
families.
Knock, right?
And you look in the Middle East and some of the teachings there towards Jewish people, and you can see what it leads to. It leads to October 7th, right? And so my theory now is, in the areas where you have CRT, the most extreme, you're likely to have the most random acts of violence towards white people. And I think if you look in New York City, you'll see that pattern being played out.
Listen, we were supposed to, like you said, you were coming in hot today, and we were going to battle, and it's just not working out too well here because we're, and I see Oscar over here. Oscar, you got to chime in. So Oscar's like our awesome tech guy. You got to chime in.
I think that you're pretty right about that, the whole viewpoint with CRT. But inherently, like, what's the issue? Who is writing the textbooks? Who is dictating education? What entity is the entity that is overseeing the education? It's local state governments, municipalities, but it all goes back to boards of education, at least in the public sector, right? Who are the people that are predominantly in power in these departments? I would say it's more common than not. It's the Caucasian white man. So
in schools,
I would say in school departments, like
is that your experience at Rutgers, where it's dominated by white Caucasians?
Well, Rutgers is different. That's not what critical race theories you're talking about. You're talking about public institutions.
But your
about
brain's developing until you're
There's
what,
a
like
cou- there's a
25,
couple things.
26?
True.
One for the audience, I don't think the audience can see, but I believe Oscar, what's your nationality?
I'm Peruvian.
He's
I'm
Peruvian.
Peruvian, yeah.
So I'm thank you for your perspective. So he's American Peruvian. He's absolutely educated and well spoken. I think you're right. I think initially the school boards were predominantly white Americans. I don't think that's the case now. When I look at the presidents of all three Rutgers campuses, the deans of all three Rutgers campuses, I think the majority of them now are not white. Or I don't. To me, what I don't think the ideology is based on racial background. I think what's happening in our country now is that there's this woke ideology, and I actually think it's losing its hold on most Americans to the point where I feel one of the reasons why they opened up the borders is because their ideas are not resonating, so they needed new votes.
Now, wait a minute.
Yeah.
They need people to mow the lawn. They need people to farm and harvest and wash the dishes. Who's going to do that?
Well, I think one of the things I'm scared of, guys, is I'm scared of that a lot of the jobs nowadays with technology are getting phased out, including our legal world now.
Chat GPT and all the open AI.
So I think, a lot of things, like one of the things Oscar said, there's some truth to everything. There's some truth that for a while the captains of the boat happen to be majority white. I think things are not so crystal clear anymore. I do think there's some truth that there's definitely a demand for cheap labor, and that's definitely one of the reasons why some entities turn the other way. But I think the predominantly push to just straight open up the borders now, it's because they're losing grasp with the American people and they need new votes.
Well, that they need votes. I hear what you're saying, because a lot of the reason with Ellis Island and then in the 20s, I think it was, in the 30s, the reason the Democrats brought in so many immigrants was because they knew they would vote for them.
I'm picturing gangs in New York.
Yeah.
I remember that.
So that there's a lot to that, but of course, undocumented immigrants that come across the border cannot legally vote. And
in some states they can.
Well, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole of the election was stolen, but so I see what you're saying about that they want the votes, but I have a little different opinion. I think I think the reason we have an uncontrolled border and they're flooding across the border goes back to the Citizens United opinion, which is that George Bush our immigration statute, I'm pretty sure, has not been amended since like the 80s. Okay, so we're working on an immigration law from the 80s. And what happens is, like on the Garden State Parkway, the speed limit was like 55 for so many years. And they made the speed limit on the Parkway 55 like in the 60s or 70s when the Parkway was invented. But at that time, the car technology was like way different than it is today. And 55 was the max speed you could safely drive, okay? And then the car technology got so much better. Your cheapest car today drives like a BMW did in the 80s, okay? And so then the law caught up with the technology, meaning they increased the speed limit on the Parkway to 65 and 70 and 80 on some other roads. But we need the same thing with immigration. The immigration law is from the 80s. The economy needs the immigrant labor, but because the politicians are concerned about being a career politician and getting the next election, and to these they can't get together and pass comprehensive immigration reform. It's crazy.
Yeah.
George Bush tried to get it because there's an economic need, and anyone thinks there's not an economic need for immigrant labor, go look at a kitchen in any restaurant you've been in lately. Go look at a house being built anywhere. And if you could magically remove all those people from the country, the economy would collapse. Yeah. So my thing is, I don't think they're flooding across the border because they want votes. I mean, I think there's probably some truth to that maybe eventually they'll get the votes if there's a path to citizenship or something. But I think the reason they're flooding across the border is because of the cartels in Central and South America is pushing them here, and then there's an economic draw for the people. And then our Congress appears to be so broken that they can't pass comprehensive immigration. I mean, isn't it crazy? Wasn't the last bill something that the Republicans were in favor of when they were in charge? But then when the Democrats, we said no.
Because God forbid it make the opposing
and now
party
we have
look
people
good,
flooding
one way or
across
the
the
other.
border. I mean, clearly the border has to be controlled. I mean, who's in favor of people flooding across the border that you don't know where they're from or what they're doing. But the point I'm making, and I apologize for jumping in so much, is I don't think it's because they want the votes necessarily. I think there's an economic draw for it, but we need to regulate it and tax them.
I think that's a very reasonable stance. And I think things have just become, and this is probably a way bigger picture, just so divisive. And I'm 35. Like I grew up and I remember the era of what you watch a presidential debate and it's civilized and things. And, you might agree someone wants, Bob Dole, someone wants like Bill Clinton, and it's whatever. That wasn't a big deal. And now I feel like you've got your camp and then there's the other camp and it's such an us versus them that you can't even get to like what Jerry just talked about. Sounds very reasonable for immigration. Like if the Democrats bring that to the table, the Republicans are like, no way.
Right.
If the Republicans bring that to the table, the Democrats are like, well, no, then we want to put this
crazy,
in there.
that's
It's never going to get done.
Yeah.
And right now, if something were to get done, it just makes Biden look good, so it's not going to get done.
It's
and then,
terrible.
It's just you hate to see a system that has worked so well for so many centuries seem that it's like kind of getting to a point where it's going to hit this critical threshold at some point.
And I think the reason is money in politics.
And that's money is speech. That's Citizens United. That speech is money, or vice versa. That whatever you throw.
Bill, have you ever go on YouTube and watch George Bush speak or Ronald Reagan speak?
Yes.
Just the class and the respectful nature of it. Like when you go to court, let's say we're in a deposition, right?
Right.
Let's say me and you are opposing lawyers in a deposition. And we go in the hall, and I say, Bill, you suck. Screw you. Blah blah. You're a. Call you everything, and you call me, and you punch me or something. Okay, let's put the punching aside. All right. Do you realize? And I didn't even realize this until about 3 years ago. Do you know that's unethical, and we can get in trouble with the bar for that? It's unethical. It's unethical so someone got caught on a hot mic doing that at a deposition, cursing out the other side. And he got, I don't know if it was suspended or admonished by the ethics people. And you could say, well, they're controlling you and okay, but there's something to be said for that. Like, I think that, like Marjorie Taylor Greene with spouting all her shit, the Democrats and the Uniparty and all this stuff. And like, if you look at like a presidential debate today, and you look at one in the 80s, and there was a class to it and a respect. I mean, I watched Ronald Reagan, and the guy was like, he's like your grandfather.
Yeah.
You want to like go hug him and stuff, even though many people wouldn't agree with his things. And I think we need to get back to that. And I think that lawyers, at least in New Jersey, and the standard that we're held to in terms of respect and a decorum, I think these politicians could learn from that.
Yeah, I think I agree with that point strongly because it's on both sides. Like you have some really out of whack Democrats who are out, senators talking about getting in people's faces and things like that. And that type of behavior at the top, it's like the broken glass theory. It leads to, okay, this is acceptable norms. And one of the big mistakes I think on the January 6th regarding the movement is basically what happened was when you're acting in a lawless manner, and it's the same thing with what happened in October 7th. But when you burn and mutilate babies, rape women, you'd lost any argument with me. You'd lost your position with me. And I think in January 6th, what happened was, look, do I have serious question marks about the integrity of the electoral process? 100%. Do I think reasonable actors can say, hey, look, they shut down this thing here, and then all of a sudden there's a bunch more votes? There's a lot of question marks. Yes. Do I think that the Emperor Augustine had the just war theory, and I thought one of the things Martin Luther King was so successful in his advocacy is he basically held the moral high ground, and I think that's one of the. I have a lot of issues with Trump's personal behavior? Yes. Do I agree with a lot of his perspectives? Yes. The one thing I have with Trump, and the reason why I support Trump, is because I think I disagree with you guys on the border. I think the Democratic Party, the woke part of the party now, is making a bold move to have one party control and complete dominance over our government in all levels. And so I think it's intentionally done to open up the border because they believe in they're going to turn Texas blue. They're going to turn some of these other states blue, and then they'll have a lockstep hold on government. And so, am I concerned with that? Yes. Do I think the reason why I advocate and the reason why I speak up is because, look, America now has so much access to technology. And right now, this is real grassroots. It's hard to have a bubble on one ideology and have a lockstep on other people's opinions. So I think it's advantageous to hold the moral high ground, to be civil in your discourse and disagreement, because guess what? I'm more likely to get the other side, their moderate perspective, to kind of at least listen to what I have to say.
Of course.
And if you start getting, look, do I think the protesters in the colleges have a right to protest against Israel? 100%. Do I think they have a right to protest for a two-state solution? 100%. Do I think they have the right to stop Jewish students from going into their classrooms?
No, that's
No.
terrible.
Yeah.
Or to stop people from the freedom of movement who are students there to go through some encampment?
Yeah,
No.
that's terrible.
There's lines to free speech and to intimidation.
But here's the one free speech issue I have, and we talked about this briefly one time when we had lunch. He came to my place in Newark. By the way, you said you guys. I'm a registered Republican, actually.
Ah. Okay.
I think I'm a registered independent.
You have to be careful. When I say you guys, I have to be very careful, right? So when
I interned for Bob Dole in college.
very cool.
My dad's a police officer. My mom's a teacher. I grew up very Republican household. But I think the part, yeah.
So I gotta take that back. What I meant is others. Look, one thing you said earlier, you said, "Hey, I know that I'm not always right."
Yeah.
I know that I'm not always right. I have plenty of experiences in my life where my perspective was off. One of the things why I was okay, I know you're a smart guy and a very successful attorney. But one of the things I agreed, and be honest, a lot of our discussions about politics, we were a little more in disagreement on some things. One of the things I think why free speech is so important and why I'm so opposed to cancel culture is, guess what? Let's hash it out.
Yeah.
And let's figure. And you know what? It's trial by fire.
But here's the thing, though,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of the genesis of this speech issue. I mean, first of all, okay. So if you take Joe Rogan, all right?
Right.
Do you ever listen to Joe Rogan?
Yes.
Okay. So okay. So like when the Stagecoach, okay, the only way you could get a letter across the country was using the Stagecoach, okay?
Yep.
A horse was like the fastest means of travel
Yes.
for centuries.
Okay. So then the people that own the Stagecoach companies are like, we're sitting pretty. We're never going out of business until guess what? The train came along, right?
Yeah.
And then the train came along, and then these big conglomerate train companies are like, we're sitting pretty. We're never going out of business. And then guess what? The international highway system came along, right? And then you had the cab companies in New York, and you had this medallion. And I got the medallion. We're sitting pretty
Uber.
until right.
Yeah. Yep.
So I completely lost my train of thought. What were we talking about? I had a point here.
I think you were talking about how right now, this brings up. You were talking about Citizens United and how basically.
What this all goes back to, I think, like the kind of divisiveness of everything, and
No, but there was something. I was making a point. Maybe
I want to tap onto something.
yeah.
So one of the things you're talking about the evolution of technology, right?
Yeah.
And you were how certain entities thought they had a monopoly
Sorry,
on it.
I remembered. Okay.
Go ahead.
So when I grew up, and probably the same with you, I think you had 5 channels. We had channel 2, 4,
Yes.
5, 7, 9, 11, and 13. So you had 7 channels, okay? And CBS, ABC, NBC were like, we're sitting pretty. And then cable came along, and then CNN is like, huh, look at us. We're sitting pretty. And then guess who came along, and that's making CNN and them all shaking their boots.
Yeah.
Who?
Fox.
Joe Rogan.
Oh, podcast.
Podcasting.
Yes.
Okay, so Joe Rogan's out there. He's got 3 podcasts a day, whatever. And then CNN would manipulate his image, twist what he says because they want to try to put him out of
Kill the
business.
messenger.
They want to put him out of business. And I agree that a lot of like CNN and a lot of these companies are in with this pharmaceutical companies because now we're going to go to break and take this drug and your life will be great. So if you say anything against the vaccine, if you say then you get shut down on social media. It's insane.
Yes.
There was people during COVID that were getting shut down on social media for just saying that, well, maybe you can just work out instead of taking a vaccine. I think we got to take a break.